Right, hello everybody, good evening, welcome. Here we are again, part 3 of the first chapter of Tanya. And tonight we get to the real start of Tanya. Everything up until this point was just to frame things and get the juices flowing and to ask questions that are really critical questions so that they get us thinking. But if you really want to find the power of what Tanya is all about, and you want to know what makes this particular book the exceptional the exceptional guide to your soul, the user manual for your soul, tonight is where it really begins to take shape. So initially we're going to just simply continue on the last bit of the theme that we started last week, and once we've fixed that picture and effectively left ourselves maybe with more questions than answers, then we can begin the process of answering questions. So just remember, you know what they say, how Jews are, that we answer a question with a question. The truth is, it's not exactly that way. The way that we answer a question is by saying, hey, hang on a second. If you really want to understand what we're talking about, let's first contextualize. And that's the purpose of the other questions that people may ask in the process of answering a question. It's just to help us to create context. Remember, this is Ba'er Heitev. That's a phrase that we've seen already a few times over here in Tanya. Ba'er Heitev means that we're going to give a really thorough explanation of whatever it is that we learn. So to get a really thorough explanation means you're not going to get the answers as quickly as you would like them. So how did we start? We began Tanya by giving a little bit of inside information. Guess what happened before you were born? What's the backstory, the secret conversation that took place between each of our souls and the dispatch team, whoever it is who sends souls down here onto earth, the conversation that took place between us and the so-called heavenly court. And in that conversation, each of us stood there and solemnly swore that we would be absolutely dedicated to be a tzaddik, a righteous individual, and not to be a rasha, not to be a wicked individual, which left us with a question. Surely that's unnecessary. Surely that's superfluous. I mean, if you've already made the commitment that you're going to be righteous, is that not automatically self-evident that you will not be wicked? Well, why do you have to say both? Sounds like one of those classic stories, you know, where you want to read the fine print and say, well, what if? You know, what's the catch over here? So we've got to ask ourselves that question. Why do we have two sides to the oath that we gave before we were born? And then that launched a whole series of questions of, well, what are these things that we're talking about? Who is a tzaddik? Who is a rasha? Who is a Beinoni? And that will become a fixation of ours over the next few chapters. What are these things? And particularly, what is this elusive concept of Beinoni, which everybody is so comfortable to translate as middle of the road kind of guy, average person, until you start to ask some really probing questions, as we did last week. And we said, hang on, a man of the caliber of Rabbah, who was this tremendously great, pious, mystical individual, spiritual leader of his time, thought of himself as a great example to share, hey, I am a Beinoni. And it was such a shocking proposal that his chief student Abaya said, well, if that's true, none of us even deserve to live. So he obviously had a different perception of what Beinoni is. He obviously did not believe that it's a person who's half of the time doing the wrong things, because ultimately Rabbah was an individual who learned Torah without pause throughout his whole life. So besides anything else, he just simply did not have the time to sin. And then we had other questions like, what's this idea that the Talmud suggests in the name of Eov that God created tzaddikim? I mean, surely we create our spiritual destiny. Isn't that a fundamental principle of Judaism? And what's this idea of a Beinoni anyway? Because if you're doing what's wrong, surely that's wicked. And if you're doing what's right and you've repented, surely that's a tzaddik. So how do you even ever fall into this middle gray area category? And those were the questions that we had swimming in our heads when we ended off last week. What we're going to do this week is two things. The first is we're going to address something very important about these labels. You've got to be really careful with labels. Now, many people tell you have to be careful with reading labels, especially on things like food. You know, make sure that you know exactly what you're getting yourself into. But the truth is that from a Jewish perspective, you have to be really careful where you apply labels. You know, if you put a label in the wrong place, it could have devastating effects. For example, if you label somebody as a tzaddik and they really are not, you might have a misunderstanding then of how Judaism is supposed to work, because you'll look at that person and you'll say, well, I think they're a tzaddik, and look at the things that they're doing, and you could learn from them, perhaps misguidedly. And likewise, if we put a label on ourselves and say, Rasha, because that was one of the things that the Alter Rebbe warned about right at the beginning. He said, careful now. The Talmud, it's the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, says, don't see yourself as a Rasha. Don't put the wicked label on yourself, for obvious reasons, because it's really self-defeating. And it's really difficult to imagine that a person is going to be motivated to do the right things if they keep labeling themselves as a failure. So labels, a really important topic. The first thing we're going to address tonight is the concept of labels and how to contextualize them. And then, please God, time allowing, we'll get to the second part of this evening, which is the discussion of how we begin to answer all of these questions by examining the nature of our souls. Notice I said plural, and that was the spoiler alert on this evening's shiur. We're about to discover something that some of you probably know and many people are unaware of. Judaism's idea of us being dual soul entities. We'll get there. So let's start first talking about labels and about how you're supposed to perceive labels. So in order to do that, we're going to ask a question. So far, without giving us answers, what the Alter Rebbe has done for us is he's raised a big question of what actually is a tzaddik? What actually is a rasha? What actually is a Beinoni? And he's left us really with our heads spinning, because effectively it appears to be that even a Beinoni never does anything wrong, because if he would do something wrong, he would be a rasha. Now, if you're a scholar, you've got questions, big questions. Let's have a look at those questions. What about the fact that, generally speaking, in Jewish literature, we say the following: that a person who is half sins and half mitzvahs is generally, in most traditional classic Jewish literature, called Beinoni. And an individual who has mostly merits, otherwise known as mitzvahs, such a person is called a tzaddik. So what do we mean? This is not thumbsuck. It's not something that we discussed around the coffee table and we came up with these definitions. These are definitions that are used in classic Jewish literature. So let's use an example. An example that you may have come across before. Comes Rosh Hashanah, and you know what they say, that on Rosh Hashanah, the heavenly court, they bring out these big books. There's the book of the tzaddikim, there's the book of the Rishoim, and there's the book of the Beinonim. Now, quite honestly, I'm pretty certain that the Gemara only wrote about them being books because the technology of the time was books. But these days, they probably bring up like this hologram of every single person where they've got all these live images and multimedia of all the things that you've done right and wrong or whatever the case is. And then they just swipe left, swipe right. It's like that kind of thing, I think, that happens today in the heavenly court. In any event, there are three categories. That's what the Gemara says, and that's what's important to us. There are three categories on Rosh Hashanah. Any person who is categorized in Sefer Shel Tzaddikim, in the book of the righteous, is automatically sent off with brocha and goodness for the coming year. It's gonna be a good year for that person. They are written in the book of life. They don't have to worry any further. They can enjoy Yom Kippur. God forbid, if anybody is written into the book of the wicked, the book of the Rishoim, then they are condemned for the year to come, and it's just going to be tzoros. In fact, the expression that the Talmud uses is that such a person is sealed, God forbid, for the opposite of life, and there's no recourse. And then the Beinonim, those are the people who have half mitzvahs and half averos. And by the way, don't think for 1 second that it means that a person has, let's say, 10,000 good deeds and 10,000 bad deeds. That's not how it works. It's not a quantity game. Sometimes you might do a small good deed that equates and outweighs a whole bunch of bad deeds. So we don't really know the accounting system of heaven. But what we do know is that the net result of some people is that they're hanging in the balance. Those people, says the Talmud, they've got to work really hard between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, because they now have a responsibility to fix themselves up and to add a little bit of good flavor into their mix, so that by the time Yom Kippur comes, they will be sealed for a good year. So you've probably heard this comment, this quotation from the Talmud in some form or another. You probably are familiar with it. And that's where we get the impression that tzaddikim are all good and Rishoim are all bad and Beinonim are hanging around in the middle. So how could we make a suggestion over here that there's anything more to the story? This is a classical Jewish text, accepted by all Jews across the board. It's the Talmud. What more do you want? And it's not just that example. There are various places where we use expressions that speak to that theme. A tzaddik, a good person, mostly good behavior. A rasha, a bad person, mostly bad behavior. A Beinoni, mostly, in between behavior. So now the Alter Rebbe is going to teach us something incredibly important. It's not only important for this conversation. This is important for understanding what Chassidus wants to achieve. We have to stop using slang. That's basically what he's going to tell us. He's going to tell us that people use expressions flippantly. And if you want to do a clinical study and really understand things deeply, you have to stop using flippant terminology. So let's understand what that means. Here's an example, okay? Here's an example. Let's say that it's pouring with rain, and you're driving down the road, and you don't see a pothole. I mean, it would never happen in Johannesburg, but let's just say you don't see a pothole in the middle of the pouring rain, and boom, you burst a tire. And now you're on the side of the road, in the dark, in the rain, and you're feeling terrible about yourself, and you're trying to think who you could call to come and help you. And while you're working it out, a good Samaritan, although that's not a nice Jewish term, pulls over to the side of the road, gets out of their car and says, here, let me help you change your tire. And they get out, they quickly change the tire, gewaldig. It wouldn't be surprising if you would say, you're a real tzaddik. You're an amazing person. You're a pious individual. And the reason you'd say that is very simply because I don't know if I would do that for somebody. I'm the kind of person, if I drove past and I saw a car stopped on the side of the road in the dark and the rain, I'd either be thinking, I don't want to get wet, or I'd be thinking, looks suspicious. Do you trust somebody in a stopped car on the side of the road? It might be an ambush. Let me call somebody else who can kind of, right? I don't know if I would have done it for somebody else, but you did it for me. So you're a tzaddik. You're a pious individual. You know how many other people drove past without blinking? So you're unusual, you're special, you're a tzaddik. Now, it's great, it's beautiful, and of course we should show gratitude, and we should acknowledge that there are really good people in this world. But it's a complete misuse of the term tzaddik. Because we don't have an objective insight into what kind of a person this individual is. We only have a snapshot of how they behaved in a particular situation where we felt vulnerable. So that's slang. That's a flippant use of the word tzaddik. That's just borrowing a term because it suits the particular concept, the particular emotion, the particular gratitude that I'd like to show this individual. And by the same token, it's possible that the other 15 people who drove past without stopping and maybe didn't even slow down and they splashed you with a big puddle on the side of the road and now you're drenched because of them, it's quite possible that you call them Russia. Russia! There goes another Russia. Why? Because you did something to me that I don't like. You did something to me that was uncomfortable. You didn't stop to help me. I mean, I don't even know who's in those cars. I didn't even see the driver behind the wheel. I have no idea of their context. I don't know. They might be a doctor running to do an emergency surgery. I don't know. But they didn't help me. So I say Russia. That's what we do. We are flippant, unfortunately, in the use of terms. And it's not really that important to us if, for argument's sake, a person says, wow, you look amazing. And we don't necessarily mean amazing. But, that's just what people say. That's not so relevant to our conversation, although it's insightful to think carefully about the words that we use. But what is relevant to our conversation is to be able to identify when a term is used in Torah literature in its honest usage or in its colloquial usage. That's important for us to know. And what we're going to see over here is that there are two expressions. There's something called a shem hamush'ol, and there's something called a shem hatoyar. So shem hamush'ol, direct translation, means a borrowed term. Shem hatoyar means an accurate adjective. So let's say, for argument's sake, there's a person who is a truly pious individual who's dedicated decades of their life to help other people at great cost to themselves. Well, then we could use a shem hatoyar. We could aptly describe that person as selfless. But if somebody decided that they were going to have me over for Shabbos because they heard that my oven went on the blink and it was a bit of a last minute thing and they were nice to me, I would be borrowing the term selfless. It wouldn't be accurate. It wouldn't be clinically appropriate. I just borrow it because it's a nice way for me to express how much I think they've done for me. So in Torah literature, we're going to see that these terms, tzaddik, rasha, beinoni, are presented in different contexts. Somebody wants to know, isn't Shem HaTorah just an adjective? Yes, of course, in normal Hebrew, Shem HaTorah is just an adjective. But in Torah language, it means an accurate adjective. So the point being that when we come across these terms, we have to always ask ourselves, how is this being presented? Is the context of our conversation about human development, spiritual status? In which case, if I'm going to use these words, they have to be Shem HaTorah. They have to be an accurate representation of where a person is spiritually. Or is this being used contextually because we need in a different conversation that is not related to spirituality, that is not about who you are in the essence of your being, but I need terms to suit this particular conversation. I need to know that I'm using a Shem HaMushal. I'm borrowing a term in context, and I'm not making a statement about the person's spirituality. So let's play that out in the words of the Alter Rebbe. So on the second line over here that you can see, Hu Shem HaMushal Inyan Sechar V'Oinish. The expression that we use, tzaddik, to refer to somebody who is mostly good, rasha to somebody who is mostly bad, beinoni to somebody who's in the middle, that is a term that we borrow outside of the spiritual conversation to apply to a different conversation about reward and punishment. Because when it comes to reward and punishment, when we have to judge somebody, that includes if it's the heavenly court who has to judge, we judge based on majority. And we will borrow the term tzaddik, meaning to say that this person is a tzaddik in the context of their court case. Because this person has come out zoiche badin, which we'd normally translate as innocent, but in this particular case would be as blessed. So let's just put it into context. Let's say that you were an Israeli commentator on a court case, and you were an Israeli commentator using Torah language, Lashon HaKodesh, not necessarily modern Ivrit, although in modern Hebrew we pretty much speak the same way. So there you are, you're commenting, there's a court case that's at play, there's Mr. Greenberg and Mr. Goldberg, and they have a big claim against each other, and it's a huge scandal in the community because they used to be good friends, and he was the gabbai of the shul, and the other guy was the shamus, and they got together in a business deal, and it went sour, and now they're in court, and this one's suing the other one, and each one claims the other one's a liar. Only one person in that kind of a court case can emerge exonerated, and the other person has to be guilty. That's just how a court works, right? That's how the law works. If there's somebody who makes an accusation against the other person, one of the two of them is right and the other one is wrong. So the court presides over the proceedings, and eventually they come to a conclusion. They say, Mr. Greenberg is the tzaddik in this case, and Mr. Goldberg is the rasha in this case. Now that's language straight out of the Torah. The Torah speaks about how in a court case we consider the convicted person the rasha, and the exonerated person, the tzaddik. Now, this is not a statement on their spirituality, because it's quite possible that Greenberg, for argument's sake, might actually be a real crook. And he might have a whole charge sheet against him that hasn't yet come to court, but the truth is that he's a swindler and a liar and extortionist and whatever. Just so happens that in this case, he happens to be the innocent party. Goldberg, on the other hand, is a beautiful human being, generous man, genuine man, dedicated at the shul every morning, helping people, giving tzedakah, very well-mannered mensch. Just so happens that in this particular case, he did something he shouldn't have done, and the court calls him rasha. I think we'll all agree that what appears on a legal document is not necessarily a spiritual analysis of a person. It's just context of that particular court case. Now, this is what's so fascinating about it. When I have to allocate either reward or punishment, the only way I can do it is to say, does this person deserve good, or does this person, God forbid, not deserve good? So Rosh Hashanah, that's what Rosh Hashanah is about. It's not a time where Hashem assesses us necessarily as the depth of who we are, because we can change that between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. On Rosh Hashanah, Hashem saying, based on the evidence presented in front of the heavenly court right now, does this person deserve blessing for the coming year, or do they deserve, God forbid, the opposite? If they deserve blessing, we put them into the book of Tzaddikim, guys who are going to have a good year. And if not, we put them into the book of the Rishonim, people are going to have a difficult year. But who the individual is and what they can do with themselves, that could change dynamically through the course of the 48 hours of Rosh Hashanah, the 10 days of Teshuvah, or on Yom Kippur. So we have to be clear about that. Anytime we come across this language, these references, we always have to know context. Are we talking about these references because we're analyzing a person in terms of their spiritual attainment, or are we analyzing this person in terms of their behavior and what consequences there should be for that behavior? That's the question. And with that, we put to bed all of the questions people say. But I saw a quotation and I read in a book, and there it seemed to imply that a tzaddik is much more accessible than what we're proposing over here in Tanya. All true, all good, not the same subject. Those are all conversations around whether the person deserves brocha in their life. We're having a conversation about what you see when you look in the mirror. And maybe that's a little bit of a clue as to why on the first page, when the Alter Rebbe told us that Talmud says that even if everybody says that you're a tzaddik, you need to know the truth about yourself, because everybody may say that you're a tzaddik, and they're borrowing a term. And it's not necessarily an honest assessment of your real spiritual stature. And because we have a responsibility at every moment of our lives to know really, where am I? What am I up to? At which point of my spirituality do I hold? So we can't take other people's views and opinions on this. We have to be introspective. And in order to be introspective, in order to know who we are, we have to have something to work with. And that's what we're trying to develop now. So, let's look. What is the Shem HaToyar? What would be the accurate adjective tzaddik? Avol le'inyan amit Shem HaToyar v'amayla. If I want to know the truest meaning of the term tzaddik, the Shem HaToyar, the way it's used in its most perfect reference. And I want to know and I want to know the real truth of what are all these multiple levels, and what is the difference between a tzaddik and a beinoni. Because why do I want to know this? Because I'd like to know who I am, and I'd like to know where I'm going. So to that, Amru Razal, to that our sages taught, tzaddikim yetzer toiv shoifton. We now are going to get our first real clue as to what a tzaddik is. A tzaddik is completely judged only by the yetzer toiv, the positive inclination. Shenemar, as the verse says, and it's King David who says this verse, Libi cholol bekirbi. My heart is hollow inside of me. Why did he say that? She'ein lo yetzer hara ki hargoi betainis. King David said that because he said he no longer had an inclination to evil, because he had successfully killed his Yetzer Hara. He had vanquished the dragon. It's quite a thought. Let's appreciate what's going on over here. King David, I think it's fair to say that King David is probably one of the most misunderstood and underrated characters in the Bible. And the reason I say that is because people think of King David, he was a king, obviously, and that's a big deal. And people think of him as a poet, which is true because he wrote the Tehillim. So the minute you say poet, people have all kinds of associations with that, some kind of a romantic, some kind of a, right brain kind of individual. But the bottom line is that King David is this deeply spiritual, pious individual. And he uses this expression, he says, V'libi cholol b'kivi, my heart is empty. Now, if you were a poet, and you would write something about your heart being empty, Well, in the way of normal poets, that would mean that you're depressed, that you feel that you've lost the love of your life. You know how it is. You know how poets are. That's usually the kind of things that they write about, Everything is about somebody who meant so much in their life. So an empty heart seems to imply that I lost all of that. And the truth is, we're going to see right now that that's not what King David means at all. King David understood something which is a fundamental principle of Judaism. And we're going to learn this in more detail in chapters 6 and in 9. Okay, chapter 6 and 9, we're going to talk about this in a lot more detail. But suffice it to say for now, the positive growth points of a person always start in their mind. If you can get your head right, if you have the right ideas, the right focus, the right contemplation, the right discipline, then great things happen. But if you don't, and you just go with your heart. Now, you've got to be careful how you say that, of course, because it's really touchy for people. People say, but you must go with your heart. Trust your heart. Sometimes you just can't. Sometimes your heart is just emotional. Sometimes your heart is just biased. Sometimes your heart is just impulsive. Those elements of the heart are what King David associated with the Yetzer Hara. Because your Yetzer Hara, the negative influence that is built into our psyche, it's never going to get us to do the wrong things using a rational argument. Think about it. Think about anything you've ever done that you've ever regretted. Did it ever start with a rational discussion? Was there ever a voice in your head that said, let me tell you that at 11 p.m., the best thing that you could do in your life is put on Netflix and eat a bar of chocolate? Rationally, it's a brilliant idea. Never. That's not rational. That's like, you know what? It's been a tough week, and you really need some downtime. Have the chocolate, it will make you feel better. So most of what happens to us in our lives, where we land up in trouble, is because we're tempted to do things because they feel good rather than they make sense. Now, that's not to say you can never land up in trouble because things make sense, but usually it's because of how they feel rather than how they make logical sense. And it's for that reason that King David talks about all this impulsivity, all this inclination to what's wrong. He talks about it as the heart. He says, I reached a point where I starved my evil inclination. The Talmud has a beautiful insight. The Talmud says that the nature of the evil inclination is the more you feed it, the hungrier it gets. It's exactly like a spoiled, petulant child. Every mother who has a spoiled child somehow believes that when you get to the third aisle in the shop and you've been asked for the 56th time to buy something, if you buy it, then they'll be quiet. Never. No sooner do you buy the thing that child says, please, 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 please. You get to the next aisle and says, oh, please, can I have one of those? Because that's an impulsive, immature way of looking at life. Whatever I want, I should get. Discipline is how you starve impulse. Discipline means I use my mind to assess, is it worth it? Is it important? Is this where I should spend my time or my energy? And that way we starve out the inclination to evil. King David succeeded in doing that. That's what a tzaddik is. A tzaddik is an individual who there's only one voice. He uses the expression from the Talmud, Yetzer Tov Shoifton. The only voice that weighs in on how to make a decision is only the positive inclination. The negative impulsive side has already given up because I'm knocking on the door, nobody's home. Reminds me of a story that there was once a follower, a chassid of the Maggid of Mezrich, who was the successor to the Baal Shem Tov. In other words, the second major leader of the Chassidic movement. And this particular student, so he wanted to know, how does a person stop impulsive negative thoughts coming into your mind? Can you imagine that formula? How do you stop impulsive negative thoughts coming into your mind? So his Rebbe said to him, listen, I'm not going to answer that question, but leave immediately right now to go to the nearby town and go to such and such a chassid, and he will teach you how to do it. Okay, he goes immediately, because if the Rebbe tells you go immediately, you go immediately. And he left, and by the time he got to the other town, it was quite late at night, and the entire town is shut down because there was no electricity in those days. So, after dark, people went to sleep fairly soon. He finds the one house, and the light is on, and there is this particular chassid, sitting, learning, late at night. It's a winter's night, it's freezing cold. He knocks on the window, taps on the window, nothing, no response. So he taps a little louder, eventually starts knocking. Knocks on the door, on the window, he's shouting, hello, shalom aleichem. The guy is poring over his book like there's no tomorrow, doesn't even lift an eyelid. Okay, eventually it's so cold that this fellow has no choice, so he makes his way to the shul. The shuls were open typically, finds himself a bench and he goes to sleep. Freezing cold in the shul. Wakes up the next morning and he goes back to this particular chassid, knocks on the door, the fellow opens the door, shalom aleichem, welcome, what brings you to town, come inside, I'll fix you a hot drink, give you some breakfast. He says, I came because our Rebbe told me that I should come to you to learn how you stop impulsive negative thoughts getting into your mind. He says, that's what he sent you to learn. That I taught you already last night. The Yetzer Hara bangs and bangs and bangs. Eventually, nobody responds, nobody answers. He goes away. That's what happens to a tzaddik. The tzaddik stonewalls the evil inclination so successfully that it just gives up. Don't you wish we had that problem? Imagine you had a Yetzer Hara that decided it was retiring for lack of interest. That's what King David describes. He says, my heart is empty. That is the shem hatoyar of a tzaddik. A tzaddik is not a description that we give to somebody based on how many things they've done, good things, bad things. Tzaddik is a definition of a person who no longer feels the impulse to do what's wrong. That's a true tzaddik. Shem hatoyar. Okay, I know what you're thinking. You're going to think, wow, does that really exist? Let's see what he says. But any person who has not yet reached that incredible level where you just don't have the inclination to do what's wrong. Even if you've got 99% good deeds and just the occasional misstep, such a person has not entered the starting blocks for a tzaddik, because a tzaddik is not measured by how many things you do or how well you do them. A tzaddik is defined by one thing only. You don't feel the impulse to do anything wrong. It's for that reason that our sages taught us in the Medrash, you want to know how rare it is? The Midrash tells us that God saw to it that it would be rare. And therefore, Omad Ushsolon Bechol Dor Vador V'chulu. Therefore, the Medrash says that God fanned out the tzaddikim across the course of history because there are not enough of them to go around. And if we'd bunch up all the tzaddikim in one period in history, other periods in history would be left with none. It's almost as if to say, you may never meet one in your life. In fact, the verse indicates this because the verse says, "V'tzadik yesoid olam." There could sometimes be a single tzaddik that is the foundation of the entire world. By the way, that goes back to the conversation with Rabba, where his nephew said to him, "You don't let anybody live." That's why tzaddik yesoid olam. Sometimes one tzaddik holds up the entire world. It's at this point in Tanya that we start the journey. Everything until now was introducing the journey. It was getting us a little bit of picture and context about these really important topics. Tzaddik, Rasha, what's a good person, what's a not so good person, which are we supposed to emulate, who are we supposed to aspire to become. That's all the backdrop of what we're going to discuss. But in order to really sink our teeth into what Tanya is about, here is the threshold. We're about to cross over into the part of Tanya that the magic starts to really happen. So what he's going to tell us is there's a teaching from Rabbi Chaim Vital. A little bit of background. About 600 years ago, there was a great tzaddik by the name of Rabbi Isaac Luria, the Arizal. You've probably heard of him. What's interesting about the Arizal is he is an outlier in every sense. While at that time in history, there was a big Jewish community in Tzfat, and that community had a very strong focus on mysticism, the Arizal was actually born in Egypt. And he was kind of out of the loop, and nobody even knew who he was. And in those days, the head of the mystical yeshiva, there was literally a yeshiva of mysticism in Tzfat. I'm sure if you've been to Tzfat, you know, you go to the cemetery and you see the ancient cemetery of Tzfat. Every few meters, there's graves that are painted in blue, which are righteous individuals. And many of them are from that period of time, these great mystics who walked around in Tzfat. So at that time, the head of the group of mystics was a man called Rabbi Moshe Cordovero. We refer to him as the Ramak. That's just an abbreviation of his name. And he was a deeply, deeply mystical individual who wrote very fundamental works on Jewish mysticism, like the Pardes, which has this whole systematic approach to understanding the structure of the spiritual universe. And then an interesting thing happened. The Moshe Cordovero was an older man at this point. He was nearing the end of his life. And he told his students that he would not appoint somebody to succeed him as the head of the yeshiva, because the individual who would succeed him would not come from within that circle, from within his sages, within his Kabbalistic academy. He said, but what will happen is that on the day, the Ramak says, on the day of his funeral, somebody would arrive, and that individual would be able to identify where they should bury the Ramak. And then everybody would know that he's the person who's supposed to take over. And then Moshe Cordovero continued, he said, and he is going to teach a different system of understanding the spiritual universe that's going to contradict the way that I've taught it. But you should accept his way because it is correct. On the day that Moshe Cordovero passed away, the Arizal arrived in Tzfat. He arrives and there's this whole commotion, there's this big funeral. And everybody, of course, is paying great homage to the individual who passed away. So he joins the funeral. And they're walking along to the ancient cemetery in Tzfat, and they go, and eventually get to a certain point, and he says to them, the Arizal says to the crowd, he says, where are you going? They said, what do you mean where we're going? We're going down there, we're going to bury him down there. He says, but don't you see that towering pillar of light that emanated from the Ramak after he had passed away, it stopped at that particular point. Why are you going further? That's obviously where he needs to be buried. So then they remembered what the Ramak had said, and it was at that point in time that the Arizal was accepted as the new head, even though he was a very young man, he was only in his 30s. He was accepted then to take over the realm, the reins of the mystical academy. And the Arizal only lived a very short time after that, only another two years or so. But in that time, he revolutionized everything that we know about Kabbalah, everything that we know about Jewish mysticism. If anybody ever claims to know anything about Kabbalah and they don't refer to the Arizal, they don't know what they're talking about. But he never wrote a word. He didn't write one word down. He had a student whose name was Rabbi Chaim Vital. And anything that we have on record from the Arizal was recorded by Rabbi Chaim Vital. So when the Alter Rebbe is going to tell us now that he's quoting something that was written by Rabbi Chaim Vital, that means that we're learning something that is a pivotal principle from the Arizal. And here comes the principle. Everybody always says that we're a body and a soul, right? And there's a whole debate. Are we souls that happen to inhabit bodies, or are we bodies that currently house souls? Okay, it's a little bit of semantics. But the bottom line is everybody acknowledges the principle that we are a body and a soul. What we're about to learn is this mega revolutionary concept that every Jewish person has to know that it's not accurate. It's not accurate to say body and soul. Instead, we have to say body and souls in the plural. So let's take a look. Let's see how he spells it out. And that will begin a conversation that starts the real depth of understanding ourselves and the real depth of understanding where we're supposed to go in life. If you don't know who you are, how can you possibly try and work out where you should be going in order to fulfill your purpose? So, the real explanation of this concept, the tzaddik, the rasha, the beinani, will be based on a concept that is written by Rabbi Chaim Vital, B'shar HaKedusha, in a section of his writings called The Gateway of Holiness, and also in a different book of Eitz Chaim Shanun Perek Beis, in a different section which is called the Eitz Chaim, the so-called Tree of Life. What does he say there? The L'chol Ish Yisrael, that every single Jewish person, Echad Tzaddik, Ve'echad Rasha, whether that person be the greatest, holiest, most spiritual member of the community, or whether they be Rasha, a wicked person, Yesh Shtei Neshamas. Every one of us has two souls. I just want to point out before we get into what the two souls are, because the language usage of here is very, very powerful. He says, Echad Tzaddik, Ve'echad Rasha. Now, the correct translation of that is whether you're a tzaddik or a rasha. But the literal translation is echad, one tzaddik, ve'echad, and one rasha. They tell a story with the Baal Shem Tov, I believe it was the Baal Shem Tov, that often on Pesach evening, before he'd begin his Seder, he'd walk around in the shtetl and just listen in on some of the other Seders that were going on the Pesach evening. On one particular occasion, he goes past a guy's house, and the fellow was an incredibly simple Jew. Very simple Jew. And here he is breaking his teeth as he goes through the Seder. You know how it is. The words of the Seder, even if you read it in English, let's be honest, it's not necessarily wording that we're used to. Anyhow, he's going through and he gets to the point where we're told that there are 4 sons. And he says, the 4 sons are Echad Tzaddik, Ve'echad Rasha, Echad Tom, Ve'echad She'einu Yodea Lishol, which is exactly the same phraseology we have here. Echad, one is a Tzaddik, Ve'echad, and one is a Rasha. Now this fellow was a simple Jew, didn't really understand Hebrew too well, but he recognized the word Echad. You know where he recognized it from? From the Shema. We say, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. And I don't know if you've ever seen it when people do this, but they go, Echad. Ever seen people do that? Echad. So he recognized it from Shul. So he did that at the Seder as well. Echad Tzaddik. Echad Rasha. And the other Hasidim who were with the Baal Shem Tov, they started to chuckle. I mean, it's quite cute, don't you think? There's a guy making a little bit of a connection to something that he read in Shul or whatever. And the Baal Shem Tov said, this man has captured the essence of that paragraph in the Haggadah. And by extension, he has captured the essence of what Judaism is. Echad means to be one with Hashem. Echad means that Hashem is the only thing that exists. There's only one entity. Echad. And what this individual saw correctly is that it doesn't matter if somebody is a tzaddik righteous or a rasha wicked. Echad, the essence of the person is oneness with Hashem. In the case of the tzaddik, it's right at the surface. In the case of the rasha, you have to dig until you find it. But the core is the same. Echad tzaddik, echad rasha. Doesn't matter what caliber Jew you are. Doesn't matter how observant you are, how kosher you are. Your soul is echad, one with Hashem. And in this particular context, Reb Chaim Vital teaches us it doesn't matter what kind of a Jew you are, there are 2 souls. How do we know this? So we know this because there's a verse, wrong verse, now, the particular verse over there sounds like God is just saying, generically, I have created souls. But we extract out of this in Kabbalah and in Hasidus that it means to each individual, Hashem has created souls in the plural. Now, our understanding of this tension, of this, firstly, we've got to know what are the differences between these 2 souls. What are these 2 souls? What do they look like? How do I know which soul is operating? What kind of tension exists between them? It's through all of that we'll get to appreciate and understand who we are, what it means to be a tzaddik, what it means to be a rasha. For this evening, our big insight is the fact that two souls exist. Now we begin a journey. What are these two souls? So in this chapter, we'll address one of the souls. And in the next chapter, we'll address the other soul. And then in chapter 3, 4, 5, we'll explain the details of that soul. And then in 6 and 7 and 8, we'll come back to the first soul and explain that in detail. And then in chapter 9, we'll begin to look at how the two souls engage and interact with each other, so that in chapters 10, 11, and 12, we can define what a tzaddik, a rasha, and a beinoni are. So now we could say that we have truly begun our journey.